Welcome to Better Than Ever Live, wherever you're watching or wherever you're listening. If you're listening to the podcast version, wherever you are, I hope you're making today your masterpiece. My name's Dr. David Geier, double board certified orthopedic surgeon, sports medicine specialist, and media medical expert. I help you feel and perform your best regardless of age, injury, or medical history. And I'm going to say this because I always forget, but just understand everything we talk about, whether it's hyperbaric oxygen for the main topic or the 3 studies that I'm going to talk about beforehand, this is meant for general information and educational purposes only. Even in the response to the comments and questions, this is general information. Yes, we're going to talk about hyperbaric oxygen. That's our main topic, what it is, how it works, how it might be helpful for orthopedic injuries like muscle injuries, and we've got some really new, interesting studies to talk about as well. If you have comments or questions, definitely leave those. The Josh Singh says hi. Hi, Josh. Jamie. I don't think Jamie's responding to me, but how are you? Robert, always good to see you here as well. Again, I'd love if you have comments about any of this, and we're going to talk about one quick thing you could do every day to lower your risk of death. We're going to talk about one potential way, really interesting way to lose weight. And we're going to talk about some foods that are good for your brain. If you have thoughts on any of that, leave those in the comments. I'll try to address those as we go. Once we hit the discussion about hyperbaric oxygen, I'm going to go a little bit into that and sort of not focus on the comments because there's a lot to get to. Sort of like what we did when we did penisin polysulfate for osteoarthritis on Tuesday. It can get kind of technical, and I'm going to try not to get too technical, but the problem is with when I do a topic like that or hyperbaric oxygen, there's so many people that say, oh, that's nonsense, there's nothing to it. So I feel like I need to at least share what studies are out there and how it might work, but then you don't want to just bog people down in terms like cartilage, oligomatrix, protein, all those fancy terms that even I sometimes stumble on. So I'll try not to do that too much with hyperbaric oxygen, but I feel like it's worth talking about. And I want to learn about this because our office just got a hyperbaric oxygen machine, so I'm really excited to that. And if you hear my phone pinging in the background, I apologize. I mistakenly got involved in a text back and forth about whether Ja Morant would be named a starter in the NBA All-Star game, which comes out today. And I can hear the phone buzzing, and I apologize if you can hear that here. All right, let's start with some studies. This first one is probably not going to surprise you, but it's a stunning number. So this was in JAMA Internal Medicine just this week. It got all kinds of media attention, and that's the journal of the American Medical Association, their internal medicine journal. And the study was very complex, but the conclusion was very simple. They took this huge database of hundreds of thousands of people and looked at all sorts of factors about nutrition and exercise and all these things to look at what might be associated with mortality. And then they did all this fancy mathematic modeling and basically figured out that and this applied to adults over the age of 40, if you just add 40 minutes, what in the world? If you're over 40 and you add 10 minutes, 40 would be worse, 10 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity to your normal daily routine, it would save the United States over 100,000 people dying every year. And it was closer to 110,000. If you increased by 20 or 30 minutes, it would save even more. But let's just focus on 10 minutes. That's just 10 minutes more a day of doing anything physical. Whether or not you exercise, just bump it up 10 more minutes. Obviously, you should exercise. But there's so many good ways to get 10 extra minutes. It's so simple. I mean, let's think about this. And I will tell you, people that know me, I really hate Instagram. So I've pretty much given up Instagram. But I know everybody I know does Instagram, and they are on it all the time. So you just turn it on, open the app, you're going to be on it 10 minutes. That's 10 minutes you can be doing yoga, body weight exercises, wall squats, and things like that. Maybe you put a kettlebell next to your desk and just do some kettlebell swings for a few minutes several times a day. Go for a walk, but if you walk, make sure you're walking fast, not some leisurely stroll. But again, 10 minutes can cut your risk of cardiovascular disease and all different kinds of death. All right. There was a really interesting article that came out this week in the New York Times. It was in their well section, which I'm not a huge New York Times person for a lot of reasons, not necessarily politics, but I really like their well section. And they wrote an article that was a summary of a number of studies. They talked about some new nutrition books that came out and interviewed a number of nutrition experts. And the premise of the article was about there are certain foods that are good for your brain. They improve your mood, they lower your risk of depression and anxiety. But what really struck me, I sort of glossed over it, but I kind of read the first couple paragraphs, and they talked about the myth of comfort foods. Now, I don't believe there's a single person watching that doesn't know exactly what I'm talking about. You're in a bad mood, you've had a long day, you're tired, so you reach for the macaroni and cheese, or the pizza, or the cheeseburgers, or the ice cream, thinking, oh, this is going to make me feel better. I absolutely have done that. I'm trying to be better about that, but I absolutely know what that's all about. Here's what's interesting about it. We know that it doesn't make you feel good physically, bloating and fatigue and lethargy and all of that. But it actually puts you in a worse mood too. And they talk about this study. It was really interesting where they gave one group of people the comfort foods, the unhealthy ones I just talked about, and the group of people that had healthy foods. And then I don't remember what kind of movie it was, but they all watched this movie and had to have ratings of emotions during the movie. The people that ate the comfort foods were in a worse mood, a much worse mood. So maybe we should call them discomfort foods. But the big thing with brain foods, one of the biggest effects is they're important in your gut health. And we've talked a lot about gut microbiome and how important that is to weight loss and a number of other things. But your gut is also where a lot of your mood hormones are made, especially serotonin. That's almost completely made and stored in your gut. So, and it's not just gut health that these foods I'm going to talk about were good for. They're good for vitamin B12, vitamins A, all the B vitamins, vitamin C, omega-3 fatty acids, and a number of different things. So, this coalition of nutritionists and nutrition experts, and based on various studies, these were some of the foods they recommended. And I think this list is fantastic. First, probably the first on everybody's list is leafy green vegetables, things like spinach, which I love, kale, maybe not so much. But this is one that's interesting that I was just giving a talk at a local health membership club, mindfulness type club last night. A lot of recovery modalities, really interesting group of people. And I spoke on osteoarthritis, but somebody spoke on nutrition, and she talked about this colorful fruits and vegetables, all colors. Red grapes, red peppers, blueberries, broccoli, carrots, squash, the whole gamut, and particularly red and purple foods, probably because of the high polyphenol content. Others, seafoods like oysters or wild salmon, nuts like cashews, almonds, beans like black beans, red beans, pinto beans, any kind of legume really, seeds like sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds. Spices are good for your brain, especially turmeric. Turmeric has curcumin, which I'll tell you is good for osteoarthritis, but it also has good benefits in terms of cognitive benefits. Another one that I've talked about on this show that I keep saying I'm going to try, I really need to, and those are fermented foods, good for your brain. Sauerkraut, yogurt, kimchi, very, very good. And then probably the best news for a lot of you, dark chocolate. They cited a study that shows that dark chocolate reduces your risk of depression by 70%. Interestingly, the comfort version of that, milk chocolate, no effect on depression at all. All right, and so yes, we're going to eat to improve our brain, make us feel better, less depression and anxiety, but what about a way to eat differently to lose weight? Really, really interesting study. I'm going to talk about this on TV here in Charleston next week. Really interesting study and scientific reports about a really unusual thing you might try to lose weight. They put 11 otherwise healthy, lean men into this study, and each of the men had to consume the same amount of food, but they did it in 3 different ways. And when they chewed the food for 30 seconds before swallowing it, so they chewed it for a long time, they increased what's called diet-induced thermogenesis. Basically, they generated more heat in their bodies during eating. Now, let's be fair. This wasn't a huge increase in calories, calories burned, but the authors of the study said, hey, if you do that for a long enough period of time, that could lead to a large change and potentially weight loss. Now, I'll tell you, I actually do believe that chewing your food very slowly before you swallow will be good for weight loss, but probably not in that reason. I mean, that may have a role, but I tell you, this is where I think it's better. Well, one thing, a lot of people will say that helps with digestion. So if you've got gastroesophageal reflux and that kind of thing. But here's where I think it might help for weight loss. If you chew really slowly before you swallow, you're probably going to eat less in every meal. By the time you get 2/3 or 3/4 done, you're probably going to be full. That satiety kicks in. So that's probably the biggest difference. But it also might lead to less impulsive eating behaviors. You eat real fast and you're like, I'm going to go for seconds. I'm going to go for thirds. I'm going to get dessert. It might lead to a lot less of that. So for what that's worth, if you have any comments on that, let me know. Let me see what we got here. Typical treatment process. I assume, Robert, you're talking about hyperbaric oxygen. So I am going to get to that. Yeah, hyperbaric. I will get to that in this discussion. So if you have any thoughts on those 3 comments, definitely leave those. If you have some on hyperbaric oxygen, I will address treatment regimen here toward the end of this. I want to explain why and how it might work, but I will discuss treatment regimen. If you have any thoughts on hyperbaric oxygen, though, I will get to your comments and questions at the end. Hyperbaric oxygen is one of those things that's been sort of quiet, but it's getting more and more popular among injured athletes because we hear pro athletes using it to accelerate their recovery and recovery from injury. It has been proposed as actually a treatment for muscle and orthopedic injuries. But if we're going to say that, we've got to talk about why it might actually help and talk about what it is. First of all, hyperbaric oxygen therapy involves lying in a chamber and you're breathing pure oxygen in a pressurized environment. And we just got ours in our office. I have yet to lie in it, but I'm kind of curious to see people that are claustrophobic, how it goes. But pressurized environment. So for it to be effective, and this is according to the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society, the pressure has to be at least 1.4 ATAs. What that means is 1.4 atmospheres, so a little bit above half as high. But to be fair, most hyperbaric oxygen chambers, it's more like 2 to 3 times the normal air pressure. What that does is your lungs absorb more oxygen, they deliver more oxygen to the rest of your body than what happens normally. When your blood has extra oxygen, carries it throughout the body, in theory, it stimulates all those tissues to heal. Now, this has been used in a lot of medicine before. It's approved for decompression sickness that occurs in scuba diving. Its biggest use is treating non-healing wounds in these wound care centers, treat infections, treat carbon monoxide poisoning. But now, let's talk about muscle injuries, because that's where I think it's really exciting. So we all know about muscle injuries. We've all had a muscle injuries, but there's a broad spectrum of different muscle injuries. There's muscle cramps, delayed onset muscle soreness, muscle contusions, muscle strains, muscle tears, and those are some of the most common injuries in all of sports and cause a lot of time that are missed from sports among these athletes. And there was a recent study, I think it was in Sports Health, that came out, looked at the most common injuries that college athletes suffer that cause them to miss 21 days from either practice or games. Muscle strains were actually the second most common injury to cause 21 days out of sports. So what does hyperbaric oxygen do? I talked a little bit about the increased oxygen delivery, but it has short and long-term effects. So short-term, yes, it enhances oxygen delivery to the injured tissue. But in terms of muscle, it reduces edema or swelling. It brings neutrophils to the site of injury, which those are inflammatory cells that help remove damaged tissue and debris. It has anti-inflammatory effects. It counters tissue damage that occurs when you have a lack of blood flow, what's called ischemia, and then all of a sudden the blood comes back in reperfusion, causes injury to that area. And when you do it over a long period of time with multiple sessions, it increases the formation of new blood vessels, it stimulates collagen production, all of which could enhance the recovery of an injured muscle. But it also has cellular effects and appears to work on growth factors. Hyperbaric oxygen treatments increase free radicals in your body and reactive oxygen, reactive nitrogen species, which activate pathways that increase the creation of growth factors. It also increases bone marrow stem cells like CD4. All right, so What does this mean when we're talking about muscle healing and muscle recovery? Well, you got to understand what happens when you injure your muscle. So let's just say you strain it or tear it. In the acute phase, your body releases all these inflammatory cytokines. The blood vessel in that area, the muscle damage, sort of open up, allowing more blood to come into that area, which bring more neutrophils and more inflammatory cells. But if that process goes on too long, you get scar tissue. That inflammation can become a bad thing. In theory, what hyperbaric oxygen does in the setting of muscle damage is it transitions the body and the muscle from that inflammatory state to a better proliferative state. Basically, this is where it gets too technical, but people that study cell biology might appreciate this. In theory, orthopedic surgeons would appreciate this. Hyperbaric oxygen helps the transition from the pro-inflammatory bad M1 macrophages to the good anti-inflammatory M2 macrophages. See, I told you, a little too technical, but I feel like that's worth talking about. And the other thing in terms of muscles is that it increases satellite cells. Satellite cells can turn into all different kinds of cells, but in the setting of a muscle injury with hyperbaric oxygen, they turn to myoblasts or muscle-forming cells, which help with muscle regeneration and in theory lead to more muscle strength. All right, so that's all good. That's all theory. Let's talk about what we've actually seen in scientific studies. Let's start with delayed onset muscle soreness. You know what that is, DOMS, where you go lift weights for the first time, you haven't lifted in a year or something, or you go skiing and you haven't been for a few years, and you have this horrible soreness 24, 48 hours after whatever that activity was. Well, really, it's hard to say if hyperbaric oxygen helps delayed onset muscle soreness. One study said that people had faster recovery from DOMS if they did hyperbaric oxygen. A bunch of other studies, it didn't really show much of a benefit. In fact, one showed that people that had hyperbaric oxygen actually had higher muscle pain at 2 and 3 days later. So it may not help that much with delayed onset muscle soreness. But muscle strains, muscle tears, muscle contusions, that's actually a big deal. And again, I told you, the second most common injury that leads to 21 days out of sports. Well, here's where we get tricky. There aren't any published, at least, research studies on hyperbaric oxygen for muscle strains or tears in humans, but there have been a number of them done on rats. So one rat study looked at hyperbaric oxygen compared to controls, and the rats that had the hyperbaric oxygen treatments had lower levels of creatine kinase, which is a marker of muscle damage. They also had higher muscle weight 3 hours or 3 days later, meaning the muscle was coming back faster. Another rat study looking at contusions or muscle bruises, they had increased new blood vessel formation in the injured muscle, increased nitric oxide, the muscle regenerated faster with all those growth factors, endothelial growth factor, fibroblast growth factor, things like that. And then a study of mice showed that they did have those increases in the myoblast growth factors. They also had more actin and myogen. Basically, the muscle cells performed better and they had better strength. Now, getting at Robert's question, what is the treatment? Let's just say you decide you want to try hyperbaric oxygen. You tear your hamstring, you tear your quad. How might you do it? All right, so most clinics that do hyperbaric oxygen do it somewhere between 2 and 2.8 atmospheres of pressure. Ours goes up to 3. We have one of the hard chambers, not just the one that's a soft bag. And so you have to have all these fire protections and all this kind of stuff. But between 2 and 2.8 atmospheres of pressure, each session takes between 60 and 120 minutes. There's a lot of debate about how long you need to do it, but generally, and we're going to do it either 60 or 90 minutes each time, but there's a lot of debate on how long and how often you have to do it. One of those rat studies I just talked about, the treatment regimen was 5 days in a row of hyperbaric oxygen or 3 treatments as long as it's within the first 3 days after the injury. There's a lot of debate about that. I think what we're going to do is twice a week for 90 minutes. That's a lot to ask for a lot of people that work, quite honestly, or go to school. So we'll probably, maybe once a week for 90 minutes or maybe twice a week for 60. Some of it will depend, not so much on science, it'll depend on people's schedules. But again, there's a lot of variability about how people use it. Now, it's worth talking about side effects. And this is where I've been a little worried as we start rolling it out among our patients. It's thought to be safe. Generally, if there are side effects, they're generally mild. usually reverse, go away. But there's two main concerns with hyperbaric oxygen. One is the difference or the inability to balance the pressure in the chamber to any gas-filled space in your body, what's called barotrauma. And then there's oxygen toxicity, having too much oxygen. First, the barotrauma. Where you're going to have trouble potentially is going to be your middle ear, your tympanic membrane or your eardrum. In theory, that pressure difference could cause your eardrum to rupture. Not real likely, but it can happen. And something else that has been reported is if you've got sinus inflammation or a polyp or some sort of nasal obstruction, that pressure difference could cause issues as well. Now, oxygen toxicity is probably more of a theoretical concern than something that happens a lot, but it's worth talking about because when you're in a pressurized environment with 100% pure oxygen, it's going to generate a lot of free radicals, and those free radicals can affect your central nervous system. So yes, you can have things like vision changes, and I have read that a lot where people have very short-term nearsightedness. It goes away pretty quickly. But other things that affect your nervous system: ringing in the ears, nausea, twitching, anxiety, confusion, dizziness, occasionally a seizure. So it's just something to know about, not something that is seen terribly often, but it is something to think about. Now, we've got to talk about one of the big caveats to all this, and that's with a lot of what I talk about. There's always issues with the research, and there's issues here. The problem with research into hyperbaric oxygen and how effective it is for muscle injuries or really anything else is that it's really, really hard to do human studies where you have a control group because you know whether or not you're getting it. Even if you lay in the chamber, you're probably going to know if it's pressurized or not. They've tried these sham treatments where the people lie in a chamber and the pressure is only like 1.1 or 1.3 atmospheres. But even that, it's hard to know if you're really blinding the participants. So it's tricky. These studies are really hard to do. What does all this mean? So hypertheric oxygen at least appears to be able to deliver more oxygen to your injured muscle, reduces the swelling, reduces the inflammation in the muscle tissue, improves blood flow to the area, improves collagen synthesis. All of that's good. So it's at least fair to say hyperbaric oxygen has the potential to help injured athletes heal a muscle injury. But we need more human studies, better designed human studies to really prove whether or not this can help muscle injuries heal and help you return to play faster. If you want to read the studies I talk about, I put links to those in the description, so definitely check those out. All right, let's see. Yeah, so Robert, I hope hyperbaric oxygen, I hope that helps. Would that affect me? 46, go to the gym twice a week. It really depends. There are more reasons than muscle injuries that people propose for hyperbaric oxygen, not counting decompression sickness, wound injuries, things like that. There is some thought that it's good for cognitive function and brain, especially as people get older. I will tell you, I haven't looked into the research on that. Maybe we'll do a video on that sometime soon. If you battle chronic muscle strains and things like that, maybe it's worth trying. I always tell people, and again, this is not medical advice, but I am a big believer in this day and age of people, especially COVID has brought this about, people wanting to take charge of their health. Talk to your doctor and look into some of these treatments and decide if it's worth trying for you. I mean, most of the things that I talk about, there aren't that many side effects or very minimal side effects. See what kind of effect they have for you. And this may be one of those for most people. Should I go to the gym more than 2 times a week? So I am probably the wrong person to ask from like a personal standpoint because I lift weights 5 days a week and I exercise every day. So I am a big fan of it. But if weights, and I think weightlifting resistance training is good for everybody. You can be a 70-year-old, 80-year-old woman. I think some sort of weight-bearing exercise is very helpful for bone density, balance, and a number of other things. Definitely feel and keeping your muscle strength to lower your risk of falls. I mean, there are tons of reasons. So yes, I feel everybody should do it. You probably don't need to do it 5 days a week. I do it because I try to look good and feel good, but that's just me. I would say, yes, 2 to 3 times a week of resistance training, and then adding 2 or 3 days a week of cardio, which anybody that knows me personally, if you're on this live chat, do not snicker, because yes, I don't do as much cardio as I would like to. Are hyperbaric oxygen treatments covered by insurance? Well, now, some people's insurance are going to be a little different. If it is a wound healing problem, decompression sickness, carbon monoxide poisoning, the things that it's approved, I don't know if it's an FDA approval, but that it's basically approved for, yes, that's probably going to get paid for. Definitely, I've had patients with wound issues after surgery, and it was covered. I doubt it's covered for something like this, just like some of the other ones. We're going to talk about it over the next few months, a number of different treatments that you may or may not have heard of, things like red light or laser therapy, shockwave therapy to help some of these injuries heal. None of those, for those purposes, is it covered by insurance. And I couldn't tell you how much this is going to cost. It's going to vary depending on the practice and who's doing it and that kind of thing. So maybe, Robert, you'll prove me wrong if you talk to your insurance company, but I'd be surprised for a muscle injury at least that it would be covered by insurance. All right, that is all I've got for you. Couple things real quick. Tomorrow, Friday, I will be here doing Ask Dr. Geier Live. If you have a bone injury, joint injury, muscle, tendon, ligament, I don't care, orthopedic injury, I'd love to at least help. Or if maybe it's a family member's injury and you want to ask questions, again, I'm not going to give you medical advice, but I can talk about what that injury is. I can talk about the treatments and some of the problems and all of that kind of good stuff in a general sense. So definitely join me noon Eastern time. I do not put that on the podcast. The podcast are the Tuesday and Thursday shows like this one. So if you're at the gym, if you can't be here live, you want to listen at the gym, listen at work, listen on your way to work, on the way home, get Better Than Ever Live wherever you get your podcast. Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher. It's at all of those. Having said that, I don't put Fridays on there, but I will be there Friday. Also, check out, if you like pro sports, you like college sports, you like to play fantasy sports or bet on sports, as many nights a week as I can, I do That's Gotta Hurt Live. That's Gotta Hurt is the name of the book that I published with a publishing company in 2017. Check that out if you like it. But anyway, I do a live show talking about the injuries of pro and college athletes. If I miss a show, it's almost always because there is truly very little to talk about, like there was Tuesday night. Last night I was giving a talk, but Tuesday night, there literally, the only thing was Anthony Davis was coming back to play. That was literally it. So I didn't do a show that night, but definitely check those out as well. Next week, we are talking about exosomes for arthritis, which is I would argue the newer thing, the shiny red ball, newer even than stem cells. So we'll talk about that and its role in arthritis. And we're going to do the ketogenic diet and athletic performance. You know, we talk about keto and does it help you lose weight and all that. We can talk about that forever. But what's really interesting, is it good for an endurance athlete? Is it good for a strength athlete in terms of how you perform? Not losing weight or anything like that. We're going to talk about keto and how it affects your performance. So a lot to get into. Real quick, Jamie, I'll answer this in case you can't be there tomorrow. Ease pain in my shoulders. Got the cortisone shot recently. It's hard to really say without knowing what the shoulder problem is. There's a big difference between rotator cuff tears, or is it just impingement, or is it instability, or things like that. Generally, I'm not real big on cortisone, and I say that not to make you feel bad, but cortisone, I talked about this a little bit last night. Cortisone can make you feel good for a period of time, but it speeds up the breakdown of cartilage, leads to faster progression of arthritis. But in the setting of shoulder, it can also weaken the rotator cuff tendons, make them more likely to tear. So I generally tell people, all right, maybe you do it once, but please try not to do that multiple times, because that's where you get into trouble. I'm a big fan of physical therapy for shoulder pain, getting the muscles, the small stabilizing muscles around the shoulder stronger to take pressure off the ball and socket. That can be really helpful. Depending on the problem, sometimes I feel like peptides can be helpful. BPC 157, sometimes thymosin beta 4. So those are some of the issues. And collarbone, it just depends if it needs surgery or not. If it doesn't need surgery, then you just let it heal and go about your business. If it does, that sucks. It's a surgery, but that surgery usually does very well. All right, that is all I've got for you. Definitely, if you know people, not comments and questions time, it is closing time. If you know people that like to hear about health, wellness, innovative treatments for orthopedic injuries, any of this type of stuff, definitely tell them about the show. Have them join us noon Eastern time on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Love to have more people comment, or again, check out That's Gotta Hurt. Not That's Gotta Hurt. Check that out too, but check out Better Than Ever Live on podcast form. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you right back here tomorrow for Ask Dr. Geier Live.